often find yourself looking at the news and feeling a temptation to despair about this world, about the brokenness of this world, how things seem to be becoming unhinged on various levels. It's easy to be tempted to despair about the state of the world. And so there's a strange way in which the Gospel of Mark is uniquely appropriate for this moment in time. The Gospel of Mark is the first of the four Gospels that was written, and scholars think that it was written between 66 AD and 72 AD, and there were two things happening during that period of time that you need to know about. One, in Rome, Emperor Nero was in power, and you may recall that he set the city on fire, and then he blamed the Christians, and then he put Christians, made them into human torches. That was happening in Rome. Back in Palestine, in Israel, there was a Jewish uprising, and the Roman forces descended upon the city of Jerusalem, and there was a siege. And after 2 years, the walls of the city were overrun, and the holy city of Jerusalem was demolished, and the sanctuary, the temple, was demolished. So these two huge, despairing events taking place. You think about them, and they make what we're going through maybe seem not so great. It's out of that context that Mark was writing his gospel. And it's the shortest of the three gospels, and it essentially has three sections to it. But at the very center of what happens in Mark's gospel is the cross, is Jesus going to the cross. The first section of the Gospel of Mark, from the first chapter through chapter 8, verse 21, Jesus is in the northern country of Galilee, and he's calling disciples who leave everything to follow him. They don't understand, but they sense there's something about Jesus that is so compelling they must follow him. He performs miracles. He heals the sick. He feeds the hungry. There's this tension that begins to arise between him and the religious authorities. And there's also this theme developing in this period about the disciples can't seem to trust him the way he is inviting them to trust. He keeps putting them in places of vulnerability, out in a boat at night, in the dark, in a storm, and challenging them to trust. You can trust. That's the first section of the gospel. And then in chapter 8, verse 22, we have the story of the healing of a blind man. It's the beginning of this second section, which ends with the story that Tracy just read. So at the beginning of the second section, there's a healing of a blind man. At the end of this section, another man is healed of blindness. The first man is healed in two stages. They bring him to Jesus. He takes him apart, and he places his hands upon the man, and he asks him, "Can you see?" And he sees, "I see, but people, they look like trees walking around." And then he puts his hands on him again, and now he can see. It's clear that Mark is using these physical healings that actually took place as a symbol of spiritual vision. That there's this process of being able to slowly come to understand what Jesus is about. And the disciples in particular are having a hard time with this. And right after that first healing is the moment in which Jesus is with his disciples, and he asks, "Who do people say that I am?" And they offer some answers. Then he asks, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Messiah." First time it's said in the whole gospel. Got the right answer, Peter. And then Jesus proceeds to say, "And as the Messiah, I must go to Jerusalem, where I will be tortured, beaten, I will suffer and die, and on the third day rise." And Peter says, "Whoa, that's not how it works for the Messiah." Takes him aside to rebuke Jesus, and Jesus in turn rebukes Peter. "You don't know the ways of God." It's central to his mission is to go to Jerusalem and lay down his life in the sacrificial love that embraces the suffering, the darkness, the pain of this broken world. And then he says, "If anyone would be my follower, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow." And then there's this pattern that continues in which it's clear that the disciples can't get it. They don't even hear the part about the resurrection because they're so caught up in that suffering part. In chapter 9, there's the story of the Transfiguration where Peter, James, and John go up with Jesus on the mountaintop and they get a glimpse of the resurrection. Jesus transformed in a glorious light. But Peter doesn't want to go back down because what's down below in the valley is suffering and pain and brokenness and the cross. He wants to skip that part and stay up in the mountain. And then for a second time in chapter 9, Jesus said, I must go to Jerusalem where I will suffer and die and on the third day rise. And after that, Mark depicts the disciples arguing about who's the greatest. It's this sort of pattern of showing he's talking about going to lay down his life, and they're still caught up in the way the world thinks. And he says, if you want to be great, you've got to be servant of all. And then you get to the 10th chapter. And then the 10th chapter is the beginning of which, that's where the story of the little children coming to Jesus takes place. And the disciples, still caught up in the way of the world, say, children, go away. You're not important enough to see this Jesus guy. And he says, if you want to be like me, you've got to love the little ones in this world. And then we have the story of the rich man who comes to Jesus and he says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, go sell everything you have, give it money to the poor, and then come follow me. And that blows the disciples away because it's often understood that if people have money, they must be blessed by God. And this is a good man who's followed the commandments. Why? He can't make it into the commandment. Then we have the third time that Jesus tells him, I must go and suffer and die upon the cross. And this time, Mark tells a story in which, just to drive home that point, that these disciples who have the eyes that can see are spiritually blind, as James and John come up to Jesus and say, listen, when you come into your glory, we want to sit on your left and on your right. And the power ceases. You can just see Jesus going, and he says, if you want to be great in the kingdom, you have to be servant of all. And the interesting little story is, future down the road, there is a moment where somebody is at Jesus' left and at his right. Do you remember where it is? On the cross. And then finally, you come to the end of this section, and there's Bartimaeus. We hear that Jesus is coming out, comes to the city of Jericho, and as he's coming out of Jericho, there is this blind beggar at the side of the road. And if we try to put ourselves in Jesus and Bartimaeus' feet, he seems to me to be an absolutely fascinating figure. How would he have known about Jesus? He would have known very little. He would have heard these stories. He would have heard about him healing. He would have heard stories about how Jesus reached out to the people that otherwise were considered unworthy. How he cared about the least. And somehow he catches hold of this. And he grasps, without even having visual sight, he has some kind of spiritual sight that others don't have. The disciples definitely don't have. And he grasps that this Jesus who's coming reveals the very heart of God. And he begins to cry out. He says, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Son of David is a title for the Messiah. It's the first time it's been used in the gospel. In some sense, it's a wrong title because it suggests that Jesus is going to be a military ruler like David, but nonetheless it indicates that Bartimaeus gets it, that this is the Messiah. This is the one who truly reveals the heart of God. And the people try to silence him. They shame him. They say, shut up. You're not important enough. And he cries out all the louder, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus hears his voice. He says, call him to me. The disciples say, get up. The master is calling. He throws off the cloak. He goes to Jesus. And Jesus asks him the same question that James and John were asked just a little bit earlier in the chapter. What is it you want me to do for you? James and John had said, we want the powers of glory. Here, Bartimaeus says, I want to be able to see again. And he says, your faith has made you well. There's some sense in which he already was well, And now he's just getting this physical healing onto it. And little detail at the very end of the story, and he followed on the way. The very next thing that happens, chapter 11, is Palm Sunday. Jesus enters into Jerusalem, and the last 5 chapters of the book will describe essentially 5 days, the last 5 days of Jesus' life. All this focus upon Jesus' death and resurrection. So, there's something that's fascinating about me, the figure of Parsippany. And in a certain sense, there's a paradox that reflects the paradox that is at the heart of the Christian faith, which is that which Jesus was saying. I must go and suffer on the cross, and then I'm going to rise from the dead. That at the heart of the story is the recognition that this world is terribly broken. That people get nailed to crosses, people get put up and made into human torches. People go into synagogues and begin to shoot people. This is a terribly broken, sinful world. There's no way to pretend it isn't. That's at the heart of the story. That's part of what the cross means. And you don't turn away from it, you turn towards it. Mr. Rogers said, when something horrible happens, look for the helpers who are going towards it. You are to go towards the pain, not away from the pain. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is the resurrection. That beyond that brokenness, there is a love that is deeper than the brokenness and the pain of this world. And the striking thing about Bartimaeus is that, on the one hand, he is utterly powerless and absolutely aware of that. He is the lowest of the low. He is a blind beggar, which would have meant, as a disabled person in that culture, it was thought somehow he had brought this upon himself for his sin. He is considered a nobody. He has to survive by begging. He is the lowest of the low. And he knows it. And he knows that his only hope is in mercy. But somehow he has the faith to recognize that in spite of the brokenness of this world and the brokenness and powerlessness of his life, at the heart of existence, there is a God who is merciful. That the final word belongs to Jesus. And he knows that Jesus will not turn him away, even though the crowd tries to tell him otherwise, tries to silence him. So he is simultaneously utterly powerless and aware of that, and yet strangely powerful. You know, he is calling out the truth that he knows, that this Jesus will have mercy on me and I won't be shut up. A strange paradox. Do you see what I'm talking about? He's aware of how powerless he is, and yet strangely he's powerful because his confidence isn't in himself. It is a confidence in the nature of God revealed in this mysterious Jesus, of which he knows very little, except that this Jesus is full of mercy and he's powerful. And that's what we're called to live out. So the third part of the story, we hear about the Passion story. And kind of a big part of that story is Peter. And Peter thinks he's powerful, you know? Remember? That's a big part of the story. Comes to the Last Supper. They'll fall away, but I have the right stuff. I won't fall away. I have confidence in myself. And what happens on the night of Jesus' arrest? He gets stripped of that illusion. He goes running for cover when 3 times he's asked, "Aren't you a friend of Jesus?" And he says, "Never met the man." And it's like he has to be brought down to that bare bones level where Bartimaeus already is, where he realizes that I have no power myself before he can get the power of the resurrection. And that's what happens, this breaking of his sense of self-confidence, so that ultimately he can discover what it means to truly trust in the mercy and the grace and the power of God. So, I find Bartimaeus fascinating. And I look for echoes of Bartimaeus today. And one of those places I see an echo of Bartimaeus is in Fred Rogers. Some of us gathered last night to watch this documentary. Fred Rogers, on the one hand, was this kind of slightly pathetic figure. He was this only child who was overweight and got mocked and was shy, and he had little puppet Daniel the tiger. And through Daniel the tiger, he channeled that part of himself that he was keenly aware of, who was still that frightened little child who, he remembered what it was like to be that little child, and he knew that that little child still lived inside of him, and he would give voice to that in Daniel the tiger. And he got mocked for, just like Bartimaeus gets mocked, for this strange way he went about television, this way he acted so weird in the eyes of so many people. And yet there was this strange power to Fred Rogers. And he saw things that other people didn't see. He saw back in the in the 50s, the power of television and how destructive it could be. The messages that were being given to vulnerable little children, that children were being entertained by mockery and violence. And he saw this. He saw how cruel this world could be. He'd experienced it, and somehow he transformed that into being this powerful instrument of grace and mercy, and giving this message to everybody that your birthright is that you are beloved of God. He had to couch it in different language, but you are special. You don't have to do anything to earn love. That's your birthright, and you go forth from that. Powerful message. And strangely like Bartimaeus, I see some similarities to Bartimaeus and that caravan of 5,000 refugees who are moving from their persecution and poverty of Honduras across Mexico 2 miles an hour. And it's absurd what they're doing. And they have nothing. And somehow yet they seem to trust that there will be mercy. And this past week, as most of you are aware, we had a vote at our church conference to become a reconciling congregation, to say publicly that we are a congregation that is welcome and affirming of gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender persons. And I think about the story of gay and lesbian and transgender people. And oftentimes it was like that of Bartimaeus. Shut up. Don't tell this truth. It's not true that this is who God made you to be. You are a sinner. Keep silent. And yet, in this journey of many gay and lesbian persons, and those who were brave enough to stick it out in the church, even when the church was telling them that they were just inherently sinful, they said, no, I have known this truth about myself since I was quite young. And you're going to tell me that this is sin. I am going to claim that God made me this way, and this is my birthright, and I am loved for who I am. And you can tell me to shut up, but I'm not going to shut up. I'm going to shout my truth. And I trust that the heart of God is not what those people who would tell me to be ashamed of myself is, but that the heart of God is mercy and love, and I am loved as I am. There's a Bartimaeus story there too. Transgendered people who, I have a brother-in-law who has this story, who as a 5-year-old recognized that he actually saw the world through the eyes of a girl, and had to live this lie for 50 years until he found the strength to claim his truth and live it out. That there's something of an echo of Bartimaeus, and there's this paradox on the one hand of needing to recognize your powerlessness, and yet on the other to trust that God is for you on a much deeper level. And there you discover a power you didn't know you had, to be stronger than you imagined you could ever be when you claim the truth of what you know. And that in the end is what faith is. Faith is not saying this world is going to everything's going to turn out rosy. The Christian faith is quite clear that this is a terribly broken world. And it's not going to change. It's going to stay broken. We may make some incremental changes here and there, but the power of sin is such that destruction is going to be there. The cross is going to be there. But we are not to turn from that pain, we are to turn towards the pain and be instruments of blessing. And we are kept from being moved into a state of utter despair because we know what is on the far side of the cross. And what's on the far side of the cross is the resurrection, which is to say, in the end, the voices of destruction, of hate, of shame don't win. That at the deepest level of reality, the God revealed in Jesus is truth. That there is mercy, there is grace, and there is a love that is greater than the powers of death, and that will be victorious. We're probably not going to see that victory in our lifetime, but we will see that victory in death. And in the meantime, we can live in that confidence and draw power from that. And to know in spite of all that temptation to despair when we look at this world that's so broken, to trust that the deepest truth is revealed in this gentle, humble man who came and said, Bartimaeus, come. What is it you would have me do for you? Your faith has made you well. Follow in my way. To offer yourself up in love as a sign of the truth of God. Please pray.